Welcome to Restoria. I'm Arthur, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story slow your thoughts and ease you softly into sleep. The Night Ferry. The harbour had settled into evening by the time Edith arrived. Light over the wooden dock had shifted from gold to amber, and the water beneath the quay had taken on that deep blue-grey it always wore in early winter, when the day gave itself up without complaint. A lantern hung from a post near the gangway, swaying in the cold air. Beneath it stood a young porter, his hands tucked into his pockets, watching the rope stretch and slacken with the breathing of the tide. A leather bag hung over her shoulder. Her coat reached almost to her boots, the wool heavy with the salt of the harbour. Her ticket was folded in her hand, the heat of her grip on it not yet faded from the long walk down from the inn at the top of the hill. The walk had been unhurried. She had paused twice on the way to look at the lights coming on in the cottages along the curve of the bay. At the far end of the quay, the ferry waited. It was not a large boat. One of the overnight crossings that slipped between the coastal towns through the cold months, a single low deck with a wheelhouse rising at the stern, and a row of round windows along the side that glowed from within. Light from those windows pooled on the black water below, and the hull made a knocking sound against the dock, the kind that belongs to old wooden things resting between journeys. Edith walked along the quay without rush. The boards beneath her boots were damp, faintly springy. The air carried the smell of seaweed and old rope and wood smoke, drifting from the inns along the shore. At the gangway, the porter took her ticket, glanced at it once and nodded without speaking, then offered his arm so she could step across the gap between dock and deck. "Cabin 7, he said. "End of the corridor on the lower deck. Easy enough to find." She thanked him and stepped down into the heated air of the ferry. The corridor was narrow, panelled in wood that had been polished by years of shoulders brushing past. Brass lamps lined the ceiling, each one giving off a steady glow that lit everything below it in amber. The floor creaked beneath her boots. From deeper in the ship, she could hear the low pulse of the engine beginning to wake. It was not yet a sound, more like the feeling of a sound, a vibration that rose up through the soles of her feet and settled into her bones. Down the length of the corridor she walked, reading the brass numbers on the doors. Each handle had been worn around its rim by 1,000 hands, and each carried a brass plate etched with its number. Cabin 7 was 3/4 of the way along, on the side that faced out to sea. The key turned. The door pushed open. She stepped inside. The cabin was small in the way that cabins on small ships are small. It held what it needed to hold and nothing more. A narrow berth ran along the far wall, made up with a thick navy blanket and 2 firm pillows, the cover tucked tight at the corners in that careful way that always speaks of someone who has done it many times. Above the berth, a brass reading lamp had been fitted into the wall, its shade tilted just enough to throw a circle of amber light onto the pillow. Across from the berth stood a low writing desk with a single drawer, and above the desk was a round window. The frame of it was a thick brass ring, polished by years of fingertips, the glass clean and faintly fogged at the edges from the difference between cabin heat and harbour cold. Edith set her bag down on the luggage rack near the door. She unbuttoned her coat and hung it on the brass hook fixed into the back of the door, then sat for a moment on the edge of the berth, her hands flat on the blanket, feeling the give of the mattress beneath her. The cabin smelled faintly of beeswax and clean linen and the siddery scent of old wood that has been kept dry for many winters. Her gaze moved around the cabin without rush. A brass hook by the door, 3 more along the wall above the berth, each one shining where many coats had brushed against it over the years. A single shelf above the desk held 3 or 4 old hardback books, their spines faded, but their gilt lettering still catching the lamplight. The titles had grown almost unreadable, less for being lost than for having been touched too many times by readers who had passed through this cabin one after another, sliding the books out for an hour and then sliding them back. Some things on a ship like this had been there longer than anyone remembered, and that was part of why the cabin felt the way it did. Beside the desk, an enameled jug stood on a tray, with a plain glass beside it and a folded white cloth. She leaned forward and lifted the glass to look at it in the lamplight. It was clean and faintly thick at its base, the kind of glass that fits a hand without thinking. She set it back down. A thin painted border ran along the wall just above the wainscoting, a repeating pattern of green leaves on a paler green ground, and where the pattern had worn away in places, it had been retouched, perhaps a long time ago, by someone with a careful hand who had taken the trouble to match the colors as well as could be done. A folded paper lay flat on the desk, pinned at one corner under a brass weight shaped like an acorn. She slid it out and unfolded it, and saw that it was the ship's list of stops along the route, each town named in the careful lettering of a portmaster long retired. The paper was thin from many handlings, its corners worn almost to silk. The names of the towns were spaced down the page in a column with no decoration at all. Reading without sound, she mouthed the names. It was a kind of prayer, that low reading. She refolded the paper and slid it back beneath the brass weight. For a while, she did not move. Around her, the small sounds of the ship gathered, the complaint of timbers settling, the faint thrum from below that was the engine still finding itself, the tap of the lantern outside her window swinging against its post on the dock. Each sound came one at a time, with little gaps between them, and she let each one in without needing to name it. Then she took off her boots. She set them neatly side by side under the desk. The floor felt warm through her stockings, more so than she had expected. Below her, somewhere in the heart of the ship, the engine had taken on a steadier note, a low hum that she could feel as much as hear. The round window held the harbour. She crossed the cabin and leaned her hands on the desk, looking out. On the dock, the lantern swung in arcs, its light catching on the wet boards and the polished brass of the cleats. Beyond the dock, The cottages of the town climbed the hill in rising rows, each window now lit with a different shade, some yellow, some honey orange, one a deep amber where someone had lit a candle in a kitchen instead of turning on the lamp. She watched the town for a long while. A figure in a long coat walked along the upper road, paused beside one of the lit windows, and went inside. A wisp of smoke unspooled from a chimney further along the curve. Somewhere, faintly, a bell rang once, then once more, the kind of bell that called nobody in particular, but reminded the town of the hour. The porter's voice came down the corridor, calling cabin numbers, telling people the dining room would be open until 9. Another door opened, another closed. Footsteps passed her cabin, careful in the narrow corridor, and faded toward the stairs that led up to the main deck. When the engine deepened beneath her, she felt it before she heard it. A small shift, a settling, the hum stretching out into something lower and more sure. In the round window, the lantern on the dock seemed to drift sideways, at first barely, then with a steadier pull. The ferry was leaving. She did not stand to watch. She stayed where she was, her hands on the desk, and let the lights of the harbour slip across the round window from one side to the other. The town's curving line of cottages slid past, each lit window holding its small story for a moment and then giving way to the next. The lantern on the dock swung once more, then dropped behind the frame of the window, and after that, there were only the further lights along the headland, smaller and smaller, and then the open water. When the last lights of the headland had thinned to nothing, Edith straightened, drew her cardigan closer around her shoulders, and went to find the dining room. There was no need to read the small painted signs in the corridor. The smell led her, an uncomplicated smell, the kind that builds through a ship as soup is set on a low simmer and bread is taken out of an oven and left on a rack to cool. She climbed the short flight of wooden stairs to the upper deck and turned right, following the corridor as it curved. The dining room was a low room near the bow. 6 round tables were arranged around its center, each one covered with a white cloth and set with simple china. Brass lamps with green glass shades hung above each table, casting little pools of green-tinted light onto the cloths. Along the walls, deep cushioned benches ran beneath a row of taller windows. Outside those windows, the sea was already perfectly black, except where the ship's own lights touched the water and made running ribbons of pale gold. 3 other passengers were eating, 2 at one table and 1 at another. A woman with grey hair and a kind face nodded to Edith as she came in, and the man at the other table lifted his soup spoon a small amount in greeting before returning to it. Nobody spoke loudly. Conversations carried in low murmurs, with long pauses between sentences, and the steady ticking of the brass clock above the door filled in the spaces. A waiter in a white linen jacket appeared at her elbow before she had finished settling into her seat. He brought her a small carafe of red wine without being asked, and a basket of bread fresh from the kitchen, and asked only whether she would prefer the soup or the lamb stew. Soup was always what she had on nights like these. It was a thing she had grown into without effort, the way some things grow into a person over the years. While she waited, she broke the bread. Steam rose from its torn middle. The crust was thick and pale, the inside faintly sweet, and a small dish of butter sat beside her plate. The butter so cold it had sweated a few clear beads on its surface. She spread it on the bread with the side of her knife and ate, and the bread was so good in that first bite that she made a small sound she had not meant to make, and the woman at the next table smiled into her own soup at having heard it. The soup arrived in a wide, shallow bowl. It was a fish soup, milky and pale, with small pieces of potato and translucent onion and the faintest pink threads of something that had been a salmon perhaps that morning. A sprig of dill floated on top, deep green against the cream. She ate without rushing, the spoon passing in and out of the bowl in a rhythm, and with every spoonful, the heat went a little further down into her chest. Up here, the hum of the engine was different, more distant, like a sound carried through walls. Below it she could hear the rush of water along the hull, a hiss that rose and fell with the rise and fall of the ship. The lamps swung very slightly above the tables, just enough to make the green glass shades cast small moving patterns on the cloths, and once or twice a piece of cutlery on a far table chimed faintly against a plate as the ship leaned into a swell. After the soup, the waiter brought her a small glass of warm spiced apple. She had not asked for it, but he set it down with a small smile and said that the cook always made it for the cold crossings. The smell rose up cinnamon bright and clove deep, and she held the glass in both her hands for a long while before drinking, letting its heat soak into her palms. The cook came out from the kitchen as she sat there. He was a man with thick grey eyebrows and an apron tied twice around his middle. He leaned against the doorframe and looked out at his small handful of late diners with a look of someone who has fed people he likes feeding. A clean cloth hung over one shoulder, and he was wiping his hands on it without rush, the way a person does when the day's work is nearly done. He nodded to her once when their eyes met, and she nodded back, and that was the whole exchange. The ship's clock above the door ticked steadily. Its sound was different from the brass clock she had at home, which had a higher tick, more like a fingernail tapping a saucer. This one was rounder, deeper, more wooden in its tone. Her thoughts settled into its rhythm without being asked, her breath drawing in to match the ticking. Outside the dining room windows, the sea lay perfectly black, but every now and then a ribbon of foam rose up along the hull and shone briefly silver in the ship's own light before slipping back into the deep water below. The man at the other table finished his stew, set his spoon down, and folded his hands on his belly. He sat without moving for a long while like that, looking at nothing in particular, and after a time, the woman with the grey hair stood and came over to his table, and he stood too, and they walked out together into the corridor in careful steps. The dining room grew a little more hushed for their leaving, and a little closer too, in the way that a room grows closer when only one person remains in it. Edith drank the last of her spiced apple, watching the ticking of the clock above the door, the green-tinted lamps swinging just a fraction above the empty tables, the hush of the water along the hull below the floorboards. When she stood to leave, the woman with the kind face said, "Sleep well." Edith said the same back and made her way through the dining room and out into the corridor, the heat of the spiced apples still in her hands. The one more flight of stairs to the open deck. The cold met her at the top of the stairs, clean in the air but not unkind. She pulled her coat tighter and stepped out beneath the wide black sky. The deck was empty. A single lamp burned at the bow, another at the stern, and between them ran a long stretch of polished wood railing, its brass fittings catching the lamplight in small, bright winks. She walked to the rail near the middle of the ship and leaned her forearms on it. The sea below was deep, deeper than the sky above, and the ferry's lights painted long, flickering ribbons of pale gold on the water that ran alongside the hull and unspooled away into the black. Behind the ship, the wake was a wide, pale road, fading into the distance, and where the road met the horizon, there were no lights at all, only the line where one darkness met another. The stars were out. Not many at first. More came forward the longer she looked, the way they always do when the eyes settle. The sky above the open sea was deeper than the sky above any town, and the stars looked closer here, the ship having carried her up into them rather than merely across the water. She picked out one of the great ones near the meridian, then another to its west, and let her eyes rest on the river of paler light between them. The cold worked into her cheeks, a small, sweet cold, the kind that does not chase a person inside, but only sits beside her at a railing for a while before letting her go. Her breath rose in white plumes that drifted upward and to the left, and where the plumes met the lamp at the bow, they took on a brief golden lift before dissolving into the night. Yeah, behind her, the wake was a long, pale road, widening, fading. A thought came of all the small ferries that had crossed this stretch of water across all the long years before this one, each of them carrying its own handful of travelers, each of them with its own small lit windows pooling on the black water. Each one's wake widening and fading into a night that was, in its essential way, the same night every time. The thought was not heavy. It rested on her shoulders the way a hand rests on a shoulder, neither asking nor giving, simply being there. Above her, the stars had filled in further. The river of paler light she had been watching had grown bands of shadow at its edges, and a single star low in the south burned a different color from the rest, a deep amber rather than the white of the others. She looked at it for a long while, and the cold worked a little further into her hands, and she pulled her gloves closer at the wrists. A faint sound came up from somewhere along the rail to her left, the chime of a brass cleat as a rope shifted in its housing, and then the night held only the rush of the water along the hull and the hum of the engine far below. The cold did not chase her in. She stayed at the rail for a long while, her breath rising in white plumes, the engine's hum coming up through the boards beneath her boots, the pale ribbon of the wake unspooling and unspooling behind the ship. Once, somewhere ahead and to the side, a single distant light blinked on the horizon and then was gone. The kind of light that might have been another ship or a lighthouse on a far island, no more substantial than a thought. When she had been at the rail long enough that the cold had reached her hands through her gloves, she straightened and turned, and went back to the heated corridor below. The corridor felt more sheltered than before, the brass lamps along the ceiling burning a touch lower as the ship settled into its night. She walked back to cabin 7 without rush, listening to the change in her own footsteps as the wood took her weight, and the small creak of the ship around her, like the long stretch of an animal at rest. Inside the cabin, she hung her coat back on its hook and sat again on the edge of the berth. The round window held only sea now, and very little of that, the glass dim except where a sweep of lamplight from the deck above caught its top edge. Above the berth, the lamp was on. She had left it burning when she went to dinner, and it had kept the cabin in its steady circle of brass-lit light all the time she had been gone. From the leather bag, she unfolded her nightclothes. They were the long shirt and the loose woolen trousers she always traveled in, the wool eased by many washings, the seams worn smooth where her hands had rested over them year after year. She undressed without rush, folding each thing she took off and laying it on the desk in a neat pile. The cabin held its heat. The floor through her stockings carried that same heat, and she did not mind the bare wood near the berth. When she had put on her nightclothes, she stood for a moment in the middle of the cabin, looking at the round window and listening to the engine. The engine was steady now, deep and unhurried, the kind of sound that has been the same for a long time and will be the same for a long time more. She felt it through her feet, through the small bones of her ankles, through the place at the base of her spine. The whole ship was making one long-held note, and her body had begun to make the same note back. At the small mirror above the desk, she brushed her hair. The bristles of her hairbrush had grown forgiving, the way a long-handled brush gets after 20 years of pulling through the same hair. Her face in the mirror was lit only by the lamp above the berth, and the amber light made the lines at the corners of her eyes look like the lines on a folded letter, the kind a person reads many times before putting it away. She smiled a little at her own reflection without quite meaning to, and the reflection smiled back. One of the books came down from the shelf above the desk. Its cloth cover was a faded green, the corners eased by many fingers, and when she opened it, the binding gave a small breath of having been opened many times before. The pages were thick and faintly cream-colored, the kind of paper used in older printings, the kind that keeps a faint heat against the fingers even when the room is cool. She read a few lines without trying to follow them, just letting the rhythm of the sentences move past her eyes, and the rhythm was unhurried and old-fashioned, the kind that takes its time to come around to its meaning. A pencil mark in the margin showed where some other reader had once paused to underline a phrase. There was no need to read the phrase to know it had been worth pausing for. She closed the book without sound and slid it back into its place on the shelf, and the lamp above the berth threw a small wedge of light onto its faded green spine before she turned away. A small kettle on a low ring near the corner of the cabin had been left there by some careful steward beside a plain china cup and a twist of tea wrapped in waxed paper. She had not noticed it before. She filled the kettle from the enamel jug and set it on the ring, lit the ring with a long matchstick from the box beside it, and watched the blue flame come up beneath the kettle's bottom. The kettle began to make its own private sound of beginning to warm, a thin singing in the iron of its base, and a few minutes passed in which she stood near it without moving, just listening to the change as the water came up to its low boil. When the kettle whistled very faintly, she lifted it off the ring and turned the switch back to off. She unwrapped the twist of tea, dropped it into the cup, and poured the hot water over it. The leaves opened in the cup, releasing their drowsy color, and the smell that came up was of dry hay and something faintly flowery, the kind of tea that has been kept in a tin in a kitchen for a long time and has taken on the smell of the kitchen as well as the smell of itself. She held the cup in both her hands and let its heat soak into her palms while the tea steeped. Sitting on the edge of the berth with the cup in her hands, she looked at the round window. The half curtain was already drawn, but through its upper half she could see the procession of stars beginning to pass across the glass. She drank the tea in small, careful sips, and each sip carried its heat a little further down into her chest, and the cup grew lighter in her hands as it emptied, and the steam from it curled upward into the brass-lit air of the cabin and was gone. When she had finished, she set the cup on the desk beside the enamel jug and rinsed her mouth with a drink of cold water from the glass. The cabin had grown a little closer. The engine had grown a little deeper. Her shoulders had grown easier beneath her nightshirt, and her hands a little heavier at her sides, and her eyes more unhurried in the way they took in the cabin's small, careful details. Then she pulled the brass curtain across only halfway, just enough to ease the night behind the glass without closing the cabin off from it. She turned back the navy blanket on the berth, climbed in, and lay down with the lamp above her on. The blanket was thick and faintly weighty, and the pillow was firm beneath the cotton case. She lay on her back at first, with her hands folded on the blanket below her chest, and looked up at the low wooden ceiling of the cabin. The grain of the wood ran in long lines, faintly curved where it followed the shape of the ship, and the lamp painted a single wavering oval of gold at the center of it. When the ship leaned a little to one side, the oval of gold leaned a little too, and then leaned back. The engine was beneath her now, beneath everything. Its low hum had become the floor of the world, the way a river becomes the floor of a valley. Above it, she could hear the hush of the water against the hull, and a little above that, the creak of timbers as the ship rose and fell over a long swell. Each small sound came in its own time. Each was as light as a hand resting on a shoulder. Her head turned a little to the side, and she looked at the round window. The half curtain hid the bottom of it, and through the upper half she could see a small piece of night sky and one bright star. The ship's motion brought the star across the upper edge of the glass, then carried it out of sight, and a moment later brought another star up into its place. The window had become a procession of stars, each one taking its time to cross before the next arrived. The lamp above the berth was warm against her cheek. She reached up and turned the brass switch, and the cabin shifted into the deeper brass-lit light that came in through the upper half of the window from the deck lamps far above. The room did not go black. It became the lower kind of light that night gives to a room when only a little light is needed, and her eyes, which had been wide with the lamp on, rested into the easier shapes around her without any effort at all. She lay there with the engine humming beneath her body. The stars crossed the upper half of the window, one after another, taking their time. She felt the ship rise and fall over a long swell, and her body rose and fell with it, and the rising and falling became something her breath began to follow without her doing anything to make it follow. Inhale on the rise, exhale on the fall. The whole sea breathing for her. A while passed. She was not asleep. She was in the place that comes before sleep, where the body has settled but the mind is wandering, drifting from one thing to another the way a leaf drifts on a low stream. Her mind went to the inn at the top of the hill, the wooden chair by the window where she had sat that afternoon with a cup of tea, watching the harbour below. Her mind went to the way the woman in the dining room had nodded to her, the small nod of someone passing another traveller in a hushed place. Her mind went to the lantern on the dock, swinging in arcs, and the way its light had drifted across the round window as the ferry left the harbour. These were small thoughts. They came and they went. They did not need her to do anything with them. Her head turned a little against the pillow. Pause. The pillow shifted with her, yielding, its cotton case carrying a faint smell of clean, cold linen and something kinder beneath, the way fresh laundry takes on the small character of the cupboard it has been resting in. The blanket along her shoulders settled a little further into its weight, and the engine beneath her went on with its long-held note, and a piece of memory came up out of the place between her thoughts. It was an older crossing she remembered. Not this ferry, a different one, much smaller, a long time ago. She had been a young woman then, traveling south to visit a friend who lived near the sea, and the ferry that night had been busy with farmers and their wives and a few young men in caps who had played cards in the corner of the lounge. She had been too tired for the lounge. She'd had taken her bag down the corridor to her cabin and shut the door, and the sound of the cards being shuffled and laid had come faintly through the wood, the kind of sound that is companionable rather than disturbing, the sound of other people being themselves through a long night. She had lain in her berth that night, on a thinner mattress, beneath a thinner blanket, with the same low hum of an engine beneath her body. The same kind of round window had looked out on the same kind of black sea, with the same stars crossing above its top edge. She had been carried then, just as she was being carried now, across a wide piece of open water toward a small, lit harbour that had come at the right time and not before. The memory was not a picture so much as a feeling. The feeling of being a young woman in a small berth on a small ferry, traveling towards something she was looking forward to. The feeling of the held note of an engine beneath her body. The feeling of the cabin holding its heat and the blanket being heavy enough and the journey being long enough that there was nothing for her to do with the long hours but to lie and let them pass. The young woman she had been then was so far away, and yet she was lying in the same posture, with the same hum beneath her, and the place between her thoughts had folded the years up like a blanket and laid them aside. It was a kind smell, the smell of an old ferry's cabin. She had not known then that she would remember it for so long, but there was a way these unhurried journeys built themselves into a person's bones over the years, the way the turning of a season builds itself into the bones of a tree. Her bones now were full of small ferry crossings, of small lit cabins, of small round windows that had held the procession of stars for her on nights very much like this one. Back into the place from which it had come, the memory faded. It had not been a memory she had reached for. It had risen of its own accord, the way small fish rise to the surface of a pond when the surface has been at rest for long enough, and it had sunk back down again the same way. She had not looked at it too closely. She had let it come and let it stay for a while and let it go. Beneath her body, the engine kept on with its long-held note. The cabin grew indistinct at its edges. On the ceiling, the lamp shadow, oval, kept its drift, leaning when the ship leaned, straightening when the ship straightened, holding its place. The blanket on her shoulders was warm. The pillow beneath her cheek was yielding. Above the desk, the round window held a small piece of dim sky and one crossing star, and behind that star another, and behind that another. She breathed in. She breathed out. The whole sea breathing for her. The ship leaned and came back. The engine's hum filled the cabin the way water fills a bath. Somewhere above, on the deck, a footstep crossed and stopped, then crossed again and faded. Somewhere further along the corridor, a door closed with the smallest click, and then everything was as it had been again, except for the engine and the water and the long breath of the timbers. The pillow yielded beneath her cheek. The blanket grew heavier along her shoulders. Her hands, folded on her chest, grew heavier with each rise and fall of the ship, and after a while she let them slide down to her sides, and they rested there, palms turned a little upward, the way hands rest when they are no longer holding anything. Above the berth, in the round oval of the window, the stars kept on with their procession. One came up into the upper edge of the glass. The ship rose, and the star travelled across. The ship fell, and the star slipped down a little. Then it was gone, and another star was there, beginning its own crossing. A small piece of time had been lost, the way one loses time on a long journey. How much she did not know. A song she had once known, half a song, came up into her mind and played itself faintly through her, in a voice that might have been her mother's voice, or might have been the voice of the sea, and then it slipped away on the next exhale,
and did not come back. The engine deepened a fraction, then settled. A wave broke without urgency along the hull. The cabin smelled of beeswax and clean linen and the cedary scent of old wood that has been kept dry for many winters, and that smell came in with each breath and went out again, neither growing stronger nor fading. This, she felt, without putting words to it, was how a person was meant to travel through a long night. Not fighting it, not waiting for it to end, just being carried, the way the ferry was carrying her, across a wide piece of open water toward a small lit harbor that would come at the right time and not before. A long stretch of moving sea passed beneath the hull. The ferry leaned and came back, leaned and came back, and her body leaned and came back with it, and the bones of her shoulders eased into the mattress in a way she had not felt them ease in a long time. The cabin around her had become very small and very near, the round window the only place where the world outside came in. A faint sound rose through the water for a moment, a low tone that might have been a far ship's horn, many miles off, or a deep current shifting beneath the keel, or a thing she only thought she heard. It came once, very faintly, and was gone, and the engine went on with its long-held note. The lamp shadows moved in their oval on the ceiling above her. Each time the ship leaned, the oval leaned. Each time the ship straightened, the oval straightened. Her eyes followed it without effort, the way the eye follows the drift of a candle flame. Of the bread in the dining room, she thought, the inside of it, and the way the cold butter had sweated a few clear beads on its surface. Of the spiced apple, the heat of the glass in her hands, the cinnamon bright smell. Of the line of cottages on the hill, each with its own lit window, each holding its small story for a moment before giving way to the next. The thoughts were not pictures anymore. They were closer to feelings, the heat of the bread, the heat of the glass, the amber light along a curve of cottages. Pictures were no longer needed. They had become the same as the weight of the blanket on her shoulders. A long time passed. The engine kept on. The water kept on. The stars in the upper half of the window kept on with their procession, one taking the place of another, and another, and another. The ship leaned, came back, leaned, came back. Her breath had become a tide of its own. Inhale on the rise, exhale on the fall. The whole sea breathing for her. Below the berth, the engine. Above the berth, the stars. She drifted for a while. She came back. She drifted again. The cabin grew kinder at its edges, and her hands grew kinder at theirs, and the pillow shaped itself further to her cheek. Each time she came back, the cabin was a little smaller and a little closer, and the engine was a little deeper, and the procession of stars in the upper half of the window had grown unhurried. Somewhere in that drifting, a thought came of how lovely it was to be carried. The thought did not need words.
It put itself there and then dissolved into the weight of the blanket. The hours passed without counting. A bell rang once somewhere far above on the deck, the small ship's bell that marked the watch. Its sound came down through the timbers very faintly, like a sound at the bottom of a well, and was gone. The engine kept on. The hull kept rising and falling on the long swells. The cabin's lamp shadow on the ceiling kept its oval drift. Once she half opened her eyes. The round window held a piece of sky that was no longer wholly black. A faint paleness had crept into the lower edge of it, the kind of paleness that comes long before dawn, when the night has begun to thin without yet beginning to lift. She watched the paleness for a small while without thought, her body too eased to lift itself, her eyes already beginning to close again. A single gull cried, very far off. Once, then nothing. Then nothing. The drifted again. The engine, the water, the rise and fall. Time stopped meaning anything in particular. There was only the cabin and the heavy blanket and the round window and the stars beginning to thin behind a paler sky. There was only the long-held note of the engine and the long-held breath of the sea. She was being carried. That was all. She was being carried across a wide piece of open water toward a small, lit harbor that would come at the right time and not before. The cabin held her. The ship held her. The sea held the ship. A small change came into the engine, very slight. Its deep note shifted just a fraction, the way a singer's voice shifts when she begins to draw a long phrase to its close. The hum had not left. The hum kept its steadiness. But there was a new feeling underneath it, an easier pulse, the feeling of a journey beginning to remember its end without yet ending. Her eyes did not open for it. She felt it through the place at the base of her spine and the soles of her feet. The ship was beginning, by very small degrees, to come into the next harbor. Far off, hours yet perhaps, but the tide of the engine had begun its turn. Into the pillow she smiled. Not awake, not far from sleep, just the smallest lift of her mouth, the way a person smiles at a kind thing that does not need to be looked at to be felt. The blanket on her shoulders was warm. The pillow was yielding beneath her cheek. The cabin smelled of beeswax and clean linen, and the savory scent of old wood that has been kept dry for many winters. The engine hummed beneath her body. The water rushed without urgency along the hull. The stars above the round window had nearly gone, their procession finished, their places taken by the paleness of a sky beginning to lift. She drifted, slow. She was held. She was carried. Far ahead, the lights of a small lit harbor were waiting, somewhere across the grey water. They did not need to be reached yet. They would be there when she opened her eyes. They would be there in an hour. They would be there in 2. The ferry kept on, the engine kept on, the sea kept on. In the cabin, in the warm circle of the brass-lit night, Edith breathed in. She breathed out. She breathed in. The ferry carried her on, through the last of the night, toward the pale beginning of a morning that did not need to come too soon. She slept.